I hadn't slept properly since the night I saw the security footage. That single decision, the choice to check the backup server, destroyed the myth I had built my life around. It wasn't the pain of financial loss, it was the sickening clarity of 4 decades wasted on people who were merely placeholders in my will. When I started Vance Logistics back in the summer of 1985, I was sleeping on a cot inside the warehouse in Houston, eating cold beans and dreaming in spreadsheets. I missed birthdays, weddings, and holidays, pouring every ounce of youth and ambition into those 18-wheelers. The company was my first child, an unruly but fiercely loved entity that swallowed my 20s and 30s whole. By the time I finally allowed myself to look up, I was a man of substantial wealth, deep exhaustion, and profound solitude. That was when Victoria entered the picture. She was vibrant, 20 years younger, and filled the echoing silence of my penthouse suite with laughter and the rustle of expensive silk. I saw her as stability, a warm harbor after the storm of building an empire. I convinced myself she loved the man, not the money, even though every piece of art she commissioned and every vacation she planned had a zero trail long enough to wrap around the globe. We had 2 sons, Michael and David, who grew up knowing only the after the struggle, after the sacrifice. They saw me as an ATM with a pulse, a necessary inconvenience whose primary function was to maintain their lifestyle until the inevitable happened. I ignored the signs, of course. A man who builds an empire out of sheer grit doesn't like admitting he's been swindled by a smile. Victoria's whispered phone calls, the increasingly opaque bookkeeping for the charitable trust she managed, and the casual disrespect from my boys, it all faded into the background noise of success. Until 3 months ago. I was recovering from minor surgery, sitting in my study, supposedly too weak to focus. Michael, assuming I was sedated, called his brother David on speakerphone. He was complaining about the delay in the new boat purchase. "Look, Dad's barely conscious half the time. He needs to just sign the papers and let us manage the transition. Honestly, how much longer can a heart like that hold out?" It wasn't malice. It was entitlement so pure it was corrosive. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning around my schedule. The final straw came a week later. I instructed my CFO, Jim, to install advanced high-definition surveillance in the annex, supposedly for inventory control. Jim, who had been with me since the cot days, knew better. He understood the difference between protecting assets and verifying loyalty. The footage confirmed my suspicions about Victoria, but with an ugly twist. She wasn't just sleeping with the head of acquisitions. She was actively discussing how to leverage an upcoming merger to siphon funds into an offshore account, all while guaranteeing I would be blamed if the SEC ever looked too closely. The realization didn't make me angry. Anger is loud, messy, and wastes energy. It made me surgical. I spent the next 2 months working with my personal legal team, a small dedicated crew in New York who specialized in high-level corporate warfare, not flashy divorces. We liquidated assets, transferred ownership, and most importantly, created the most convincing, detailed corporate collapse anyone had ever seen. The goal wasn't just to leave them, it was to simulate a financial supernova and watch them panic in the dark. I called the family meeting on a Thursday afternoon. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking frail, my face carefully pale. I delivered the news with a shaky voice, citing aggressive short-selling, bad hedge bets, and the sudden closure of a major overseas contract. Vance Logistics, I told them, was gone. Everything was being seized by creditors. The Dallas mansion, the accounts, the trusts, all gone, or so close to it that they'd be fighting legal battles for years over the scraps. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and utterly devoid of concern for me. Victoria cried, but not for my pain. She cried for her cancelled trips to the Hamptons. Michael didn't even pretend. Wait, the trust funds? The whole portfolio is gone. What are we supposed to live on? They quickly settled on a plan. Since I clearly couldn't manage myself anymore, and since they couldn't possibly afford the upkeep of the mansion, I needed to be placed. They found a spot, a dismal, poorly funded assisted living facility near the edge of Fort Worth called Sunset Valley, a name dripping with poetic irony. It was the cheapest place they could find that wasn't legally derelict. They drove me there 3 days later, handing the administrator a small check and promising to visit when things settled down. I watched them drive away, the silence of the facility settling around me. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. I was wearing an itchy polyester gown and holding a plastic bag containing my few possessions. It was exactly what they thought I deserved. I waited until 8 p.m. when the night nurse, a sharp woman named Martha, finished her rounds. I pulled the small burner phone from the inner pocket of my robe, a detail they somehow missed. "It's Arthur Vance," I whispered into the phone. "Tell Mr. Chen the paperwork is complete. We need to finalize the transfer of ownership tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, you understand the magnitude of this investment? You just purchased the entire property." "Yes, I know," I said, a slow, deep smile finally reaching my eyes. "The Vance Trust still has considerable assets in non-liquid, untraceable holdings, and I prefer to supervise my enemies from a position of comfort. After all, if I'm going to be living in Sunset Valley, I might as well be the landlord. I need to make sure the staff is well compensated for the show they're about to put on. Starting tomorrow, the rules here change, and my children who believe they left me destitute in a poorhouse are about to learn what true bankruptcy feels like. The worst kind of fool is the one who mistakes silence for surrender. My children and my former wife, Eleanor, had spent their entire lives confusing my patience with weakness, believing that the exhaustion of 4 decades building Vance Industries had left me too brittle to fight back. They thought they had successfully relegated me to the dusty obscurity of Sunset Valley, a quaint little trap that they assumed would catch my last failing breath. They couldn't have been more wrong. The irony was delicious. They continued to live in the Newport mansion, spending money they no longer truly owned, while I sat here in the quiet comfort of the estate they believed was a glorified hospice, personally signing the deeds that made me their silent landlord. The staff, the kind, professional faces they had dismissed as merely caretakers, were, in fact, the final layers of my intelligence network. They were receiving double their usual pay, not to fetch me tea, but to run diagnostics on the customized security system I'd had installed shortly after Eleanor first suggested selling the company to secure our futures. I dedicated the next few weeks to simply watching. I didn't need to hire private investigators to stake out their parties. The feeds were routed directly to a secured server in the basement. I watched my youngest son, Julian, crash the new Aston Martin, a purchase made 3 days after they seized control, and then laugh about the insurance claim over a dinner of imported truffles. I watched my daughter, Clara, use the corporate jet for weekend shopping trips to Milan, charging hundreds of thousands in personal expenses to accounts she believed were now sanitized and untraceable. Each video clip, each intercepted email, each financial ledger forwarded by my Boston legal team was another heavy stone added to the grave they were digging for themselves. The pain wasn't in the financial loss. The pain was in the confirmation. When you build an empire, you sacrifice everything for the next generation, often rationalizing your absence by believing the wealth itself is the ultimate testament of love. To realize that they viewed 40 years of my sweat and sacrifice merely as a giant liquid asset waiting to be plundered, it shattered something ancient inside me. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a character assassination of the man I thought I was. My lead counsel, Mr. Thorne, a man whose reputation for cold, surgical execution preceded him across 3 continents, called me every morning at precisely 7 a.m. His voice was always crisp, his reports devastatingly detailed. "Mr. Vance," he'd say, "Harrison has just approved the sale of the New Orleans division. They valued the intellectual property at 30% below market to a shell corporation registered in the Caymans. We have the wire transfer details, the signatures, and confirmation that the shell company is owned entirely by Eleanor's cousin, Robert." I would listen, my knuckles white against the mahogany desk, and simply respond, "Thank you, Thorne. Continue the data aggregation. Do not, under any circumstances, allow the litigation department to file anything. I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel invincible." The deeper they plunged into the corporate reserves, the more vulnerable they became. They were using the company like an ATM, ignoring the foundational covenants and compliance regulations I had meticulously layered into the corporate structure back in the late 90s. Those safeguards were not there to protect me from competitors. They were there to protect Vance Industries from the kind of opportunistic greed that destroys legacies. I focused specifically on the Vance Irrevocable Trust, the entity they had entirely forgotten existed, or perhaps never knew the true power of. It was the fail-safe, the ultimate insurance, policy. When I established it in the summer of 1985, I included a clause, a dark necessary contingency, that allowed the trustee, myself, provided I was still alive and mentally sound, to unilaterally revoke all beneficiary status if proven acts of fraud, malfeasance, or fiduciary neglect were documented against the primary beneficiaries. It was a cold, cruel clause, but I had written it not for my children, but for the company, fearing the day when youthful indiscretion might jeopardize thousands of livelihoods. I never dreamed I would use it against my own blood. Now the legal team was simply compiling the evidence to trigger the mechanism. It wasn't about winning a divorce settlement or reclaiming a chair on the board. It was about triggering a complete instantaneous legal annihilation. Eleanor called me one afternoon, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She was calling to confirm I had settled into my new, simpler life. "Robert," she sighed dramatically, "you sound well. I told Harrison you just needed a little rest. That old heart of yours, you know, it needs quiet." "I am perfectly quiet, Eleanor," I replied, my tone flat, emotionless. "The air here is quite clean, and the staff is excellent." "Good. We're having a large charity gala next week. The foundation needs the support, now that we're restructuring the company's portfolio. Shame you won't be able to make it." "A shame," I agreed, a faint, chilling smile touching my lips. "Tell me, Eleanor, are Harrison and Julian giving speeches? Will the entire board be present?" "Of course," she chirped. "It's a major public announcement, the new direction of Vance Industries." "Wonderful," I murmured. "Please send me the exact schedule. I would hate to miss the moment they announce their vision for the future." I hung up, leaning back in my leather chair, the glow of the dozen monitors reflecting in my eyes. The fools thought they were planning a celebration. They were, in fact, planning the perfect stage for the delivery of the final judgment. The execution order was ready. All I needed now was the perfect audience. Next week, the silence would end, and the only sound they would hear would be the deafening crash of their world collapsing around them. They believed the stage was set for my retirement, a polite, gold-plated shove toward the grave. I could hear the echo of Evelyn's voice from the dining room just last night, discussing the new summer itinerary for the yacht, the one she planned to charter after the inevitable, the one she spoke of with the casual certainty of a weather forecast. She didn't even drop her voice when she mentioned the date David, my only son, had set for the transition, as he called it. They treated my 4 decades of sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights building this empire, this legacy that stretches from Seattle shipping, docks to Dallas tech firms, as if it were a trust fund waiting for maturity. Their blindness was not just arrogance, it was a profound failure of imagination. They saw the tired, silver-haired man who needed reading glasses and took a pill every morning. They didn't see the man who survived the brutal corporate wars of the late 80s, who signed billion-dollar deals on instinct, who always calculated 5 moves ahead in any game of chess. They forgot that I built this fortress not just on ambition but on absolute control. And control once lost is lethal to those who assumed its absence. The investigation was a masterpiece of cold, quiet efficiency. I didn't hire a clumsy private eye in a trench coat. I hired 3 distinct teams, compartmentalized and operating independently under non-disclosure agreements that would bankrupt them if breached. The first team was forensic accounting, led by a former SEC investigator. Their job wasn't just to track the money Evelyn and David were siphoning off for their lavish lifestyle adjustments, but to document the methodology, the dummy corporations in Panama, the inflated invoices routed through David's shell companies, the clear, prosecutable evidence of fiduciary theft against the foundation I established for the employees' college funds. That evidence, bound in 3 heavy numbered volumes, was already securely filed with the district attorney in Wilmington, Delaware, ready for an immediate federal warrant the moment I gave the signal. The second team handled the digital footprint. They installed state-of-the-art surveillance systems, not clumsy hidden cameras, but microscopic lenses embedded in the air filtration units and custom-coded keystroke loggers on every personal device they owned. I watched Evelyn meet her fitness instructor, a man half her age, in a rented cottage outside of Aspen. I watched David boast to his friends about how he was systematically inflating company shares before the old man finally kicks it. I listened to Evelyn during a tearful phone call with her sister, confirm that her love for me had died sometime around 1998, and that she only stayed because of the financial security she deserved. That conversation was the quietest moment of the entire process, yet it delivered the deepest wound. It wasn't the betrayal of the flesh that stung, that I had anticipated, sadly, but the cold, deliberate calculation of 20 years wasted, 2 decades where I mistook professional respect for genuine affection. It was a failure of the heart, a cavity that only justice could fill. I had been planning a legacy. They were planning a wake. The third team was my legal hammer. 3 of the most ruthless family law and estate attorneys money could buy, each unaware of the other's full scope of work. They worked for 6 months, meticulously, dismantling the marriage and the complex structure of the corporate trusts. Every clause, every contingency, every loophole Evelyn and David might have relied on was sealed shut, double-checked, and firewalled. We used a little-known clause in the company charter that stipulated any executive found engaging in gross financial misconduct that jeopardized employee pensions or foundation assets automatically forfeits all stock options and non-vested assets, effective immediately, upon confirmation by the board. Since I control the board, the confirmation was a formality. David's entire future, which he saw painted in gold and private jets, rested on stock options he hadn't fully vested. The moment those 3 heavy volumes hit the DA's desk, David would be standing naked in the corporate wind. As for Evelyn, her execution order was a simple, brutal prenuptial agreement signed decades ago in the rush of young love, which my current legal team had spent months reinforcing. They discovered she had unknowingly violated a crucial morality clause years ago, a detail the surveillance team gladly provided. The terms were clear: a fixed, non-negotiable settlement, a fraction of what she expected, and 0 claim on the primary residence or the family holdings. Every piece of expensive jewelry, every painting she'd bought using my corporate credit cards, every gift from the last decade was documented as company property, ready for immediate repossession. I spent my afternoons in that sterile, soundproof office, watching them live their lives. They continued to spend, oblivious, mocking the old man's outdated methods and counting the days until my supposed demise. I saw the invitation for the Patriarch's Legacy celebration next Friday, a black-tie event at the Four Seasons in downtown Seattle, meant to be my farewell party. They had rented the entire ballroom. It was perfect. A public stage, hundreds of witnesses, maximum exposure, and an official record of the proceedings. I signed the final documents last night, crisp blue ink against thick parchment. The paperwork detailing the irrevocable divorce filing, the internal corporate audit results, and the notification of the federal investigation were all bundled and timed for delivery. They were scheduled to arrive via certified messenger at Evelyn's attorney's office, David's corporate headquarters, and the Four Seasons concierge desk, precisely 30 minutes after I began my final speech. The silence I maintained all these months wasn't complacency. It was the absolute, deadly calm, required to pull the pin on a grenade and wait for the precise moment to let go. They had mistaken my quiet observation for weakness. Soon they would understand that the silence of a determined man is the sound of a closing trap. Next week the party would begin. But the only legacy left standing would be the ruins of theirs. They mistook the quiet dedication required to build an empire for the senility of a man who was ready to cash out. They saw the tired, slightly stooped shoulders of a 65-year-old widower, or what they assumed was a widower, given how absent Eleanor had become, and they read it as weakness, as capitulation. They failed entirely to see the coiled spring beneath the tailored suits, the mind that had crushed competitors in the market. Trenches of New York and Chicago since the summer of 1985. Michael, my son, had perfected the art of the condescending sigh. During our last board meeting discussing the Q4 projections, he actually patted my arm. "Don't worry, Dad," he said, loud enough for the junior analysts to hear. "We'll handle the transition smoothly. Just take it easy. You've earned a rest." He used the word rest, the way a veterinarian uses the word sleep. Eleanor, his mother, didn't even bother. With pretense. The new Aspen condo, the one she insisted required a refresh costing more than the average American's lifetime earnings, was finalized the same week I was supposedly hospitalized for a minor cardiac procedure. A procedure I deliberately exaggerated to test their concern. They failed the test spectacularly. Michael flew to Aspen, not to my bedside. Eleanor called my private nurse, not to ask about my prognosis, but to ensure the wire transfer for the imported Italian marble had cleared. That casual, breathtaking disregard was the final nail in the coffin of any lingering affection I might have felt. It confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were actively hoping for it, while simultaneously draining the reservoir I had spent 40 years filling. My silence, for them, was permission. They thought I was too slow, too technologically inept, or too heartbroken to notice the subtle hemorrhaging of funds. They missed the critical detail. A man who can build $1 billion conglomerate from a single loan collateralized by a beat-up Ford pickup doesn't stop understanding leverage, risk, and, most importantly, surveillance. I didn't hire a local private investigator with a zoom lens and a cheap sedan. I retained the services of Obsidian Group, a firm specializing in corporate forensics and counterintelligence, operating out of a discreet office tower in Dallas. The team lead, a woman named Ms. Chen, didn't talk about catching them in the act. She spoke in terms of metadata analysis, encrypted communications intercepts, and tracing Shell Corporation dividends. They treated the betrayal not as a personal tragedy, but as a hostile takeover attempt that needed to be documented, dissected, and irrevocably neutralized. For 6 months, Obsidian Group operated a shadow audit on my own life. Every phone call Michael made to his mistress, a partner in the firm, a delicious piece of irony, was logged, not for the salacious dialogue, but for the precise moment he discussed diverting R&D funds to cover her lavish spending. Every signature Eleanor forged on the quarterly expense reports, detailing non-existent charitable donations that went straight into her private offshore account, was forensically matched to her handwriting samples. We didn't need a judge to believe us. We needed undeniable, unassailable proof that would stand up against the best defense attorneys money could buy. The evidence piled up in the secured vault in Hayes's office, my lawyer of 30 years, who believed we were simply preparing the most aggressive estate plan of the decade. He was right in a twisted sense. The most critical component was the full restructuring of the Sterling family trust. I knew that simply cutting them out of the will would lead to years of litigation, giving them time to bleed the operational assets dry. My solution was surgical. Working with a specialist in fiduciary law, we identified the revocation clauses. The trust was built on the premise of good faith, loyalty, and continued commitment to the Sterling legacy. Breach of these covenants, explicitly defined to include documented theft from the holding company or material marital infidelity, triggered an immediate, irrevocable transfer of the majority assets. The recipient of this transfer, not a new wife, not a distant cousin, the Robert J. Sterling Charitable Foundation, dedicated to supporting veterans' transition programs, an entity I had quietly established in 1995, one that had remained minimally funded until now. The execution required precision timing. Hayes finalized the paperwork. Digital copies of the incriminating evidence, the forensic reports, the audio logs, the bank statements, were uploaded to a secured server, ready to be time-stamped and released the moment the trust transfer was executed. Michael's fate, Eleanor's fate, was tied not to my death, but to a single, legally binding action, the activation of the revocation clause. I sat in my library in Greenwich, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock I bought in Geneva in my 20s. I ran a hand over the smooth wood. I hadn't raised children, I had raised vultures. The party they were planning next week, the annual Sterling Summer Gala, which they intended to use as an informal announcement of Michael's increased role, would be the stage. They expected toasts, applause, and my silent submission. They would get silence, certainly, but it would be the silence that precedes a detonation. The grenade pin was already out. All I had to do was drop it. The pain of watching them fall was negligible compared to the pain of realizing who they truly were. I had dedicated my life to securing their future, and they had dedicated theirs to destroying my past. They would soon learn that the foundation of the Sterling Empire was not built on sentimental affection, but on cold, hard, unyielding law. And the law, when wielded by a disappointed patriarch, is the cruelest weapon of all. They believed the old man was slowing down. That was the core of their fatal miscalculation. The facade I maintained required more energy than running the entire Sterling Corporation had ever demanded. I had to inhabit the role of the tired, slightly senile patriarch whose primary function was signing checks and occasionally offering irrelevant anecdotes about the struggles of 1985. Every sigh, every slow climb up the grand staircase in the Scottsdale estate was a practiced performance. They ate it up. They didn't just underestimate me, they actively enjoyed my perceived frailty. At dinner, Eleanor, my wife of 35 years, the woman I had pulled from a small-town obscurity and set upon a throne of comfort, would casually discuss the plans for the new wing of the house. A wing I had explicitly stated was unnecessary. "It's an investment, darling," she'd chirp, never meeting my eyes, always looking at Julian, our son, who would nod approvingly. Julian, who had spent the last 5 years running a phantom subsidiary that existed only to drain operating funds into his gambling debts. "You look tired, Dad," Victoria, my daughter, would chime in, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "Maybe you should just take a sabbatical. Let Julian handle the quarterly reporting." A sabbatical. They wanted me to step away so they could finally dismantle the edifice I had spent 4 decades building, brick by painful brick. They were vultures circling a carcass they assumed was already cold. They never saw the steel hidden beneath the white hair, the cold logic that had elevated me from a young man with nothing to the master of a multi-state logistics and energy empire. Their arrogance was my shield. It allowed me to move in plain sight. I started the investigation not with a phone call, but with a deep dive into the corporate infrastructure. The Sterling Empire had been built on robust, encrypted data storage. Most of my family only knew how to use the corporate credit cards. They had no idea how to read the metadata streams I had personally designed in the late 90s. My primary base of operations shifted from the mansion to a discreet, windowless office tower I owned in downtown Phoenix, a holding property that no one in the family ever bothered to visit. It was there, surrounded by monitors displaying cold, objective data, that I faced the truth. I didn't need a cheap private detective staking out a motel. I needed forensic accounting and digital intelligence experts. I hired them through 5 different shell companies registered in Delaware, ensuring the paper trail led nowhere near my personal assets. The first files confirmed Eleanor's relationship with Mark, her personal trainer. It wasn't just a clandestine affair. It was an open secret among the household staff they thought I was too deaf to hear or too blind to notice. The real heartbreak wasn't the infidelity. The emotional connection between Eleanor and me had evaporated years ago, replaced by mutual convenience. It was the financial implications. Mark wasn't a partner. He was a liability, already receiving substantial funds funneled through Eleanor's charity foundation. The next set of files, provided by the internal security team I secretly reactivated, showed Julian's methodical embezzlement. Not just borrowing, but systematic looting. He was siphoning millions, justifying it with fake invoices for non-existent overseas contracts. And Victoria, my sweet, seemingly devoted daughter. Her communications revealed something worse than greed. A conversation with Julian, where she explicitly referenced how much longer the old man has, and the estate lawyer, Mr. Thompson, is completely useless. Thompson, my trusted, lifelong legal advisor. The moment I saw that name linked to their conspiracy, the last vestiges of my paternal affection died. I didn't confront Thompson. I simply sent him a single encrypted file labeled 1997 Audit. Thompson, a man who valued his expensive golf courses and retirement fund, knew exactly what that meant. It detailed a minor, highly illegal tax maneuver we had executed 2 decades prior, which I had documented and archived as insurance. Within 48 hours, Thompson was gone, citing sudden health issues, replaced by a young, hungry, and frighteningly efficient attorney named David Chen, who answered only to me. Chen and I worked in silent tandem. The goal was not divorce or simple disinheritance. The goal was surgical. Annihilation. We meticulously reviewed the entire Sterling Trust. 4 decades ago, I had written in a series of obscure, interconnected clauses designed to protect the assets from external attack. These clauses, centered around fiduciary loyalty, morality, and corporate good standing, now became the instruments of their destruction. Eleanor, Julian, and Victoria's entire financial existence was tied to their status as loyal beneficiaries. If that loyalty could be legally proven to be breached, and I had thousands of pages of documented evidence, audio recordings, and notarized affidavits proving just that, the trust would immediately trigger a revocation of privilege clause. They would not just be disinherited. They would be legally obliged to repay every asset they had misappropriated, plunging them into immediate, insurmountable debt. The most satisfying part was the surveillance footage I had installed in Julian's downtown office. He and Victoria were celebrating, toasting with expensive scotch, unaware the camera was feeding directly into my encrypted server in Phoenix. "He's barely coherent now," Julian slurred on the video. "The latest paperwork Chen sent over is just boilerplate nonsense. He doesn't even read it. We're in the clear." Chen had in fact sent over the final documents, a complete restructuring of the Sterling Trust, which, buried deep within 50 pages of technical jargon, contained the irreversible execution order. Julian had signed it, not reading past the first summary paragraph, believing he was signing off on routine quarterly adjustments. The grenade pin was out, as I had noted before. But now, I had wrapped the grenade in legal steel, aimed it directly at the foundation of their lavish lives, and secured the trigger to their own arrogant hands. All that remained was the moment of delivery. I looked at the digital clock on my Phoenix desk. 3:00 a.m. Scheduled the final corporate board meeting for Friday. It would be an ordinary meeting, where the Sterling family would gather one last time. They would expect a simple announcement about profits. They would receive something far more binding. I shut down the monitors, the silence of the room returning. The pain was still there, a dull ache, but the rage had been replaced by a chilling clarity. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was merely enforcing the terms and conditions they had willfully ignored. They had tried to steal my life's work. They were about to discover that the cost of doing business with the Sterling Corporation was absolute, immediate, and final. The silence in my private office on the 40th floor of the Sterling Tower was always absolute, designed to filter out the noise of Manhattan and the trivial chaos of the world below. But lately, that silence had been fractured, filled by the ringing echo of their laughter, a sound I was now certain was aimed directly at me. They saw my measured pace as decrepitude. They misinterpreted my deliberate calm as senility. Eleanor, my wife of 42 years, had perfected the art of the patronizing gaze. She'd pat my hand gently at dinner, asking if I remembered to take my blood pressure medication, all while drafting the interior designs for the Aspen chalet she planned to buy with the inheritance she was so sure was imminent. Michael, my only son, didn't bother with the feigned concern. He simply accelerated his consumption, treating the company accounts like an inexhaustible ATM, assured that the weak old man was too busy fading away to notice the monthly drain. They were so busy counting the millions they expected to inherit that they failed to realize I was already counting the days until they had nothing left to count. This profound, total underestimation was their most costly error. They believed I was a relic of a bygone era, a man who built an empire on handshakes and paper contracts. They didn't consider that the same meticulous focus required to dominate the global logistics market in the 80s was now being applied to their private lives. They had installed their own corporate spy, a young VP named Harrison, whose sole job was to funnel proprietary information to Michael and keep tabs on my health schedule. What they didn't know was that Harrison had been on my payroll since his first day out of Harvard, a contingency plan I'd put in place years ago when I first noticed Michael's entitlement curdling into active malice. The investigation wasn't messy, it was surgical. I didn't hire the typical gumshoe with a camera and a trench coat. I utilized the same intelligence infrastructure I used to secure multi-billion-dollar contracts in politically volatile regions. I called Marcus. Marcus didn't wear a badge. He wore a three-piece suit and specialized in forensic destruction. I need a complete digital excavation, I told him during our first meeting, held not in my office, but in a secure, soundproofed room beneath an unassuming warehouse in Queens. Every text, every email, every encrypted chat regarding the offshore trust they established. I want the metadata on their communication with the board members they've been grooming. Leave no trace, Marcus. Make it look like server drift. Marcus, a man whose expression remained permanently neutral regardless of the severity of the crime, nodded once. And the physical assets, Mr. Sterling? They are operating under the assumption of anonymity, I continued, leaning back. The chair groaned slightly under the weight of decades. I want to confirm every transaction tied to the Cayman Islands entity. I want photographs of every property, every piece of jewelry, every receipt for every extravagant trip they've taken this past year, cross-referenced with the funds illegally diverted from the R&D budget. Within a week, the data flowed in a torrent. It wasn't just proof of the corporate theft, it was a devastating portrait of their private existence. Michael was not just skimming from the company, he was funneling money to two separate individuals. One, a struggling actress in Los Angeles, the other, a high-end mistress in Miami. Eleanor, meanwhile, was liquidating assets from my personal portfolio, the portfolio I'd earmarked, for the Sterling Foundation, to fund her secret art collection, featuring pieces bought at inflated prices through a gallery owned by her brother, who was also discreetly on the company payroll in a no-show position. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They had used the 4 decades of sweat equity I poured into this foundation, the early mornings, the missed birthdays, the ulcers developed during the recession of '92, as their personal piggy bank. I spent the next month in quiet preparation, turning raw data into immutable, courtroom-ready documentation. The legal team, led by my personal counsel, Mr. Jennings, a man who understood the concept of absolute loyalty, prepared 2 sets of papers. The first was the divorce filing. It was an ironclad document utilizing the moral turpitude clause, ensuring Eleanor would walk away with exactly the prenup specified amount, enough to live comfortably, but nowhere near enough to sustain the gilded cage she had built around herself. All shared assets, including the main residence, were legally secured under the Sterling Corporate Trust, untouchable by her claims. The second was the revised company charter and the new will. This was the masterpiece. Michael was a minority shareholder, holding shares I had gifted him on his 21st birthday, shares that carried weight but not control. The revised charter included a clause that Jennings had carefully crafted 30 years ago, almost as a joke at the time. Any shareholder found guilty of fiduciary malfeasance or corporate sabotage would forfeit all shares immediately, without compensation, and be subject to full criminal prosecution initiated by the corporation. It was designed for external threats. They had never considered it might be used internally. I printed the documents and placed them in 2 separate sealed envelopes, one labeled Eleanor, the other Michael. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a surgeon who has successfully excised a tumor that was slowly killing the host. The day of the annual shareholder meeting approached rapidly. They were planning their final move, a vote to restructure the board, which would effectively dilute my power and transfer control to Michael's favored cronies. They saw the meeting as their coronation. I saw it as the stage I had meticulously prepared for their final performance. I walked into the tower that morning, feeling the weight of the silver in my hair, the stiff linen of my suit, and the absolute certainty of what was coming. I greeted the security guard, smiled faintly at the receptionist, and took the private elevator straight to the top. I was exactly where I needed to be. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was ring the bell and watch them walk in. They were still laughing, somewhere down the hall, blissfully unaware that the floor beneath their feet was about to disappear. I took my seat behind the imposing mahogany desk, the one I had custom-made in Dallas 20 years ago, and listened. The sound was faint, a high-pitched, careless tittering that drifted through the thick soundproofing of the 60th floor. It was Erica's laughter, certainly. My wife. A symphony of betrayal that for 4 decades I had mistaken for devotion. Beside her, I could make out the deeper, self-satisfied chuckle of Michael, my only son. They were discussing the new Aspen property, no doubt, a premature Christmas gift they had decided I should fund. They didn't just spend my money, they spent my effort, my time, my life, with an appalling sense of entitlement. Their greatest mistake, the one that sealed their fate far more effectively than any forged signature or illicit rendezvous, was their complete and utter underestimation of me. They saw the silver in my hair and mistook it for rust. They saw the fatigue in my eyes, the consequence of building this empire brick by meticulous brick since the Reagan administration, and they assumed it meant weakness. They believed I was too sentimental, too distracted by the quarterly reports, or perhaps most damningly, too old to notice the quiet larceny happening under my own roof. They thought the old bull was ready for the slaughterhouse, his mind dull and his claws retracted. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I didn't build this corporation, this multinational edifice of steel and glass and leveraged billions by being a fool. I built it by seeing 5 steps ahead, by anticipating the betrayal of competitors, and by eliminating threats with surgical, impersonal precision. Why would I apply a lesser standard to my own blood? The realization that they were actively waiting for me to die, not just passively hoping, but actively planning to accelerate the inevitable through financial depletion and emotional stress, came last spring. It wasn't a grand cinematic moment. There was no smoking gun left on the kitchen counter. It was a digital slip, an email thread I found buried deep within Michael's shared drive, detailing how they planned to leverage the Houston assets immediately after the inevitable transition. It spoke of my life, my legacy, with the cold, calculating detachment of vultures circling carrion. The grief was immediate, a physical shockwave that left me, breathless against the polished surface of the desk. But the subsequent rage was cold. It didn't demand screams or confrontation. It demanded structure. It demanded justice delivered not by emotion, but by the relentless, crushing weight of verifiable truth. From that moment I became invisible. I continued to play the role of the aging, slightly absent patriarch. I nodded vaguely when Erica mentioned the need for a new security budget, code for funding her lover's failing startup. I signed papers Michael placed in front of me, knowing they contained frivolous expense reports because I needed him to believe the charade. I needed him to grow careless. And he did. Their confidence was their collaborator. The investigation began silently, professionally. I didn't hire some cheap trenchcoat-wearing PI. I engaged the Blackwood Group, a firm specializing in corporate espionage and high-level internal affairs. They didn't watch them physically. They mapped their digital footprint. I brought in Eliza Vance, the best forensic accountant in the tri-state area, under the guise of an internal audit review for the board. She spent 3 months in a windowless room on the 45th floor, tracking every offshore transfer, every shell company Michael had set up, every dollar Erica had funneled to her various charities that coincidentally funded her new life in the Hamptons. Eliza confirmed what I already knew. They had siphoned nearly $20 million over the past 5 years, treating the company treasury like an unlimited credit line. The evidence was devastating. Not just proof of infidelity, though the photos of Erica and her personal trainer Blake meeting in Miami were certainly conclusive. but definitive proof of fiduciary malfeasance, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud the company's shareholders, me, primarily. I spent the last 2 months working exclusively with Randall and Stern, my corporate attorneys. They didn't draft a typical divorce petition. They drafted a controlled demolition plan. We weren't just separating assets. We were initiating a legal and corporate hostile takeover of my own life. Everything was finalized an hour ago. The special clauses in the partnership agreements, dormant for decades, were activated. The offshore accounts, which Michael thought were safely under his control, were tied to the master holding company, which, thanks to the refiled corporate statutes, was now 100% controlled by me, and me alone. The legal documents were sealed, time-stamped, and filed across 3 states simultaneously. I reached out and touched the heavy, sealed manila envelope resting on the blotter. Inside were the notarized demands for repayment, the notice of termination for Michael's executive role, and the detailed, indisputable grounds for divorce, citing egregious financial misconduct. The board of directors meeting was scheduled for precisely 3:00 p.m. They would arrive laughing, expecting the usual dreary presentation on Q3 profits. They expected me to announce my retirement, perhaps, or to hand Michael the reins of the European division. They expected an inheritance. Instead, they would get the reckoning. I glanced at my watch. 2 minutes until the scheduled arrival time. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust of 4 decades of labor on my tongue. I had built this world to protect my family. When my family became the threat, I simply used the same tools to dismantle them. The elevator doors chimed softly down the hall, announcing their approach. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the polite, slightly strained silence they always adopted when entering my presence. They still hadn't figured out that I wasn't listening with my ears anymore. I was listening with the silence of the grave I had dug for them. "Come in, Erica." "Michael," I said, my voice steady, betraying neither pain nor triumph. "We have much to discuss." The floor beneath them was ready to give way, and I, the old bull they thought was blind, was ready to watch them fall. "We have much to discuss," I repeated, settling deeper into the heavy leather chair that had been mine for 30 years. The air in the penthouse office, high above the frantic pulse of downtown San Diego, thickened instantly. Erica crossed her legs, adjusting. The hem of her silk skirt, a purchase made, no doubt, with funds she assumed were already hers. Her expression was a practiced blend of concern and impatience, like waiting for an elderly relative to finish a long, dull anecdote before signing the check. Michael, my son, slouched against the bookshelf, texting, barely bothering to look up. He was already the CEO in his own mind, just waiting for the old man's heart to finally give out. They didn't see me. They saw a fading asset. They saw the tired, pale man who had nearly collapsed on the golf course 6 months ago. They saw the obstacle to the sterling fortune. "Dad, if this is about the quarterly projections, I already told Richard to send you the summarized report," Michael mumbled, his thumb flying across the screen. "We're hitting the targets. You don't need to micromanage." Micromanage. The word tasted like ashes in my mouth. I hadn't built Sterling Holdings from a 2-man operation in a dusty garage in 1985 by micromanaging. I had built it with 40 years of 18-hour days, sacrificing weekends, birthdays, and my own health. I had built it so they wouldn't ever have to worry about a quarterly report. "It's not about the projections, Michael," I said gently. The quietness of my voice always disarmed them, making them assume I lacked energy, not intent. "It's about the foundation, the integrity." Erica sighed dramatically, running a manicured hand through her perfect blonde hair. "Darling, we know you value integrity, but we are in the 21st century. Everyone takes shortcuts. If this is about the Aspen trip last month, it was a necessary networking function." I studied her face. 30 years ago, I saw ambition and light. Now I saw calcified greed and the utter void of gratitude. She truly believed that because I had failed to raise my voice, I had failed to notice the 6-figure transfers to the offshore accounts, the blatant infidelity with the tennis instructor in Miami, or the quiet, steady hemorrhaging of the company's capital that Michael was orchestrating. Their arrogance was my shield. Their conviction that I was a senile relic was the perfect camouflage. They believed they had been subtle, but subtlety is a luxury only afforded to those who have not been watched by a man who has perfected the art of silent surveillance. The investigation started not with anger, but with a cold, precise dread the moment I found the burner phone hidden beneath Erica's jewelry box. Not the messages, but the sheer lack of imagination in her hiding spot. That dread turned into purpose when I realized Michael wasn't just incompetent, he was actively positioning the company for a hostile takeover by the very competitor I had spent a decade fighting off in the early 2000s. He was selling his birthright for a fast exit, assuming I would die before the paperwork finalized. I didn't storm out and scream. I didn't hire a divorce lawyer the next day. I hired intelligence. I brought in Jonathan Kincaid, a digital forensic expert who typically worked for the government, and 3 of the most brutal corporate attorneys in New York, flying them in quietly to my secondary residence in Monterey. For 4 months, they worked in the shadows. We installed cameras that looked like fire sprinklers in every room of the main house. We used keystroke, loggers on every executive computer Michael touched. We didn't look for proof of their betrayal. We looked for the paper trail that would prove their crimes. Betrayal is emotional. Crime is legal leverage. The financial audit of Michael's division was a masterpiece of meticulous deceit, proving he systematically overinflated invoices and funneled the difference through shell corporations in Delaware. Erica's contribution was simpler. Documented evidence of asset stripping, not small purchases but large unauthorized liquidations of rare art and securities, deposited directly into accounts only she controlled. No, Erica, it isn't about Aspen, I continued, leaning forward just slightly. The movement forced Michael to finally stop texting and look at me. It is about the truth, and the truth, gentlemen, is always inconvenient when you've built your life on convenient lies. Michael scoffed, trying to regain control. What are you talking about, Dad? Are we going through a phase? I ignored the insult. It was just noise now. My focus was on the 2 thick, leather-bound folders sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk. I had a health scare recently, I acknowledged, letting the vulnerability hang there, baiting them. It made me think about continuity, about who deserves to inherit this legacy, and more importantly, who deserves to be protected from their own destructive nature. I picked up the first folder, the one marked Sterling Redefined, and placed it squarely in the center of the desk. For the past 4 months, while you two have been enjoying the dividends of my labor, I have been working tirelessly to ensure the future of Sterling Holdings, I explained, my eyes scanning their confused faces. I thought you might have been doing the same, but the evidence suggests otherwise. I paused, letting the silence scream the gravity of the moment. They still didn't understand. They expected a lecture, a threat to cut their allowance for a month. They didn't expect the floor to evaporate beneath them. I know about the funds you moved, Michael. All $14 million. I know about your agreement with the Denton Group to divest our manufacturing sector by the end of the year. And Erica, I added, turning my full attention to my wife, whose carefully constructed composure was finally starting to crack. I know about the apartment in downtown Chicago, the one you share with your personal investment advisor, and I know exactly how you paid for it. The color drained from her face. Michael's jaw dropped. The moment of underestimation was over, the moment of stark realization that the old bull had not just opened his eyes but had sharpened his horns and secured the gate, had arrived. I did not raise my voice. I merely tapped the folder. The documents contained within this binder formalize the immediate freezing of all personal assets linked to your recent activities, Michael. They also initiate the legal restructuring of Sterling Holdings, moving all voting shares into a blind trust managed by an independent board. And, Erica, you will find the final, non-negotiable terms of our divorce. Effective as of noon today, every single cent traceable to corporate fraud has been returned and accounted for. You are both welcome to keep what you earned honestly, which, as the evidence shows, is precisely nothing. The trap had sprung, and I finally was ready to breathe free. The air in the boardroom was thick and electric, like static before a lightning strike. Erica's face, usually so meticulously composed, the result of weekly treatments and the best cosmetics money could buy, was melting into a mask of pure, ugly disbelief. "You can't do this, Richard. Sterling is half mine. We built this together," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the polished mahogany table, where for 22 years we had entertained senators and CEOs. I remained seated, resting my hands on the arms of the chair. My knuckles were pale, but my voice was level, requiring no effort at all. "No, Erica. I built Sterling. You spent the profit. And as my attorneys have just demonstrated with undeniable clarity, the only assets you've touched in the last 7 years were those generated through a systematic, documented scheme to defraud the shareholders, including me. You own nothing but the clothes on your back and the jewelry I gifted you before I knew you were stealing from under my nose." The man beside her, young, slick, and far too comfortable in a boardroom he hadn't earned the right to stand in, leaned over and whispered something frantic in her ear. I watched the interaction with the detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. Their entire strategy, their leverage, their very belief system relied on the assumption that I was a tired, sentimental old fool, ready to sign whatever papers they slid across the table, eager only for peace in my final years. That was their fatal mistake, the blindness of entitlement. They confused my patience with senility. They mistook the quiet dedication that built a billion-dollar empire from a single warehouse in Detroit back in the summer of 1985 for a lack of fighting spirit. They saw the silver in my hair and assumed the wires in my brain had frayed, that the ruthless calculation required to survive the commodity wars of the 90s had been replaced by soft sentimentality. They couldn't have been more wrong. The moment I found that first unauthorized transfer, a sloppy digital footprint left by a junior accountant working under Erica's direction, I didn't confront them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even show discomfort. I smiled that night at dinner, listened to the plans for their extravagant trip to the Maldives and kissed her goodnight. But when the light went out, Richard Sterling, the husband, went into hibernation. Richard Sterling, the architect of corporate warfare, awoke. It started with a single burner phone and a conversation with Marcus Hale, a forensic accountant I trusted implicitly, a man whose loyalty I purchased with generous compensation and decades of mutual respect. Marcus didn't just look at the numbers, he looked at the story the numbers told. We brought in a private intelligence firm out of Boston, not just detectives, but specialists in digital surveillance and corporate espionage. They didn't wear trench coats. They wore tailored suits and knew how to penetrate encrypted financial ledgers without leaving a trace. For 18 months, I built my fortress. The hardest part wasn't the technical maneuvering, it was the emotional discipline. Every week, I received reports detailing meetings between Erica and her collaborators, the planning sessions, the backroom deals, the outright mockery of my supposed obsolescence. I saw images of the man she was seeing, the one she planned to replace me with once the old man finally kicks the bucket. Each piece of evidence was a shard of ice confirming the betrayal, but I didn't allow it to crack the calm exterior. I needed to see it all, not just for the divorce, but for the criminal liability I was building. The goal was not merely separation, it was surgical excision. We used sophisticated network mapping to trace every dollar stolen, ensuring every single transaction was categorized as corporate malfeasance, not just marital debt. This was crucial. By classifying the funds as corporate fraud, I preemptively shielded Sterling Holdings from the massive legal fallout and protected the company's legitimate employees and investors, the people who actually earned their livelihoods honestly. I used the time they wasted, planning their future on my dime to solidify mine. While they were picking out new waterfront property in Miami, my legal team was restructuring Sterling Holdings into a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies so complex that even the best corporate raiders couldn't unravel it, much less my soon-to-be ex-wife's clumsy legal team. We moved the core voting shares into a blind trust managed by 3 external, unbiased, and highly ethical figures, People whose only interest was the long-term stability of the corporation, ensuring Erica would never again have a voice in the operation. "Your lawyers will attempt to contest the prenuptial agreement, Erica," I stated, finally pushing myself up from the chair. My movement was slow, deliberate. "But they will fail. The prenup was ironclad, and furthermore, we have provided the state attorney's office with a detailed dossier concerning the RICO violations and wire fraud. That investigation is independent of this divorce, and it is already underway." The realization hit them then, a sickening, delayed punch to the gut. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a threat. It was the aftermath of an irreversible decision. Erica lunged forward, her denial dissolving into pure, panicked desperation. "You bastard! You won't get away with this! We will tie this up in court for years!" I simply watched the panic flicker in her eyes, the last vestige of her power fading. I had already anticipated the legal fight. Months ago, I had created a separate, smaller offshore foundation in the Caymans. This entity was perfectly legal, utterly clean, and entirely unknown to my family. It held enough liquid capital to fund 20 years of relentless, scorched earth litigation. Litigation solely designed to ensure they stayed absolutely and completely ruined, draining them of whatever pitiful personal savings they might try to hide. The full weight of the company, the family name, and the entire legal establishment was now arrayed against them. They were facing financial ruin and criminal indictment, and they hadn't realized the war had begun until the surrender documents were placed in their hands. I walked toward the door, leaving the two lawyers to deal with the inevitable emotional outburst. As I reached the threshold, I paused, turning back one last time to the woman who had spent 2 decades waiting for me to die. "Keep fighting, Erica," I advised, the calm in my voice colder than any winter in New England. "Please, I have all the time in the world, and now I have nothing left to lose." I closed the door softly behind me. The noise from the ensuing collapse was muffled by the solid oak, but I didn't need to hear it to know its magnitude. I stepped into the hallway, the morning sun streaming through the skyscraper windows of downtown Manhattan. I was alone, certainly, but for the first time in a very long time I was genuinely free. The weight I had carried, the disappointment, the deceit, the constant performance of the loving husband, was gone. The trap had sprung, the execution was clean, and now the long, quiet peace could begin. The mahogany door to Sterling's private library closed with a definitive, almost ceremonial thud. It wasn't the sound of an ending, but the prelude to one. I took my place at the head of the polished table, the morning light catching the dust motes dancing over the stack of legal documents. Opposite me sat Amelia, meticulously dressed, radiating an air of impatient confidence, flanked by Jason and Chloe, who looked less like heirs and more like vultures waiting for the carcass to cool. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds for years, perfecting the look of grief and the subsequent demand for immediate access to liquidity. Their mistake, the one that had cost them everything, was believing I was oblivious or worse, too weak to act. They had spent the last 5 months, the period between my retirement and this reading, running up bills, treating the company credit cards like monopoly money, and openly discussing their future renovation plans, all while assuming the old man was too busy fading away in the penthouse to notice the intricate web they had woven. Mr. Sterling, a man whose face had long ago mastered the art of neutrality, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the three of them with something akin to pity, then met my eyes. We understood each other perfectly. "We are gathered today," Sterling began, his voice dry and professional, "to formally review the current structure of the Hawthorne estate and the associated philanthropic trusts, following the recent dissolution of the primary living trust." Amelia leaned forward, a brittle smile on her face. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Could we dispense with the formalities? I assume the details of the original settlement remain intact, regarding the Manhattan properties and the immediate cash transfer," Jason chimed in, equally dismissive. "Yeah, we have some pressing expenditures, Sterling. Just tell us the bottom line." I watched them, 4 decades of shared history shrinking down to this single pathetic moment of naked greed. I had built the Hawthorne Group from a garage operation in Queens in the summer of 1985 into a corporate pillar. Every brick, every acquisition, every late night spent on red-eye flights was fueled by the vision of a legacy, a secure future for the people I loved. They saw it only as an ATM with a slow withdrawal speed. Sterling paused, his gaze dropping to the final document. Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Hawthorne, Ms. Hawthorne, there has been a significant modification executed late last year. Amelia's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. What modification? Richard, what is he talking about? You said everything was set. I spoke, my voice low, steady, and utterly flat. It cut through the room's expensive silence like a glass shard. The original settlement was based on a premise of shared loyalty, fidelity, and mutual respect, Amelia. Those conditions, as you know, ceased to exist many months ago. Her face flushed deep scarlet, the color rushing past her perfect makeup. How dare you bring that up now, you old fool? This is about assets, not ancient history. It is entirely about history, I corrected, leaning back slightly, and legal precedent. Mr. Sterling, please read paragraph 4 of the new instrument. Slowly. Sterling adjusted his glasses again. The primary assets of the Hawthorne Group, including all equity, real estate holdings, and liquid capital, have been irrevocably transferred into the Richard Hawthorne Foundation for Global Education. This foundation, chartered in Delaware, has been legally structured to operate independently, managed by a non-family board of trustees. Silence. A cold, absolute vacuum of sound. Chloe was the first to realize the implication. Wait, what about our quarterly allowances? My trust fund? Sterling continued, oblivious to the rising panic. Regarding the beneficiaries of the dissolved living trust, the settlement is final and non-negotiable. Amelia, Jason, and Chloe Hawthorne are each granted a single, non-transferable annuity of exactly $25,000. Amelia shot up from her chair, rattling the expensive china water glasses. 25,000? Are you insane? We spend that on maintenance fees in a month. Richard, this is illegal. You cannot simply erase 40 years of marriage. I didn't erase it, Amelia, I said, meeting her furious eyes. You did, and I documented the process meticulously. I gestured slightly towards a thick manila envelope placed deliberately near Sterling's elbow. That envelope contains the evidence required by the court to establish gross misconduct, financial malfeasance, and material breaches of marital agreement. The surveillance footage, the audio recordings, the depositions of your associates, and your lover. It is currently sealed but will be released to the press should you contest this settlement in any way. That hit her harder than the loss of the money. She didn't fear poverty. She feared public humiliation. The thought of her society friends seeing the truth of her petty, small-scale deceit paralyzed her. She sank slowly back into her chair, her composure finally shattering. Jason, still clinging to the idea of corporate control, stammered, "But the company? I'm the vice president of acquisitions. I have access." "You had access," I corrected, my voice dropping back into that dangerous calm. "The acquisition division was dissolved 3 weeks ago, Jason. Your keycard was deactivated this morning. You are currently trespassing, and the $400,000 you misappropriated for that failed Texas venture, consider it a gift, but it is the last one you will ever receive from me." Chloe started to cry, the sudden realization that the endless stream of cash had dried up, hitting her harder than any emotional betrayal. She wasn't crying for me. She was crying for her cancelled credit limit. The collapse was total, silent, and instantaneous. They looked like statues carved from salt, melting slowly under the sun of their own exposed entitlement. I stood up, pushing my chair back gently. I didn't need to say another word. The legal language had already delivered the fatal blow. "Mr. Sterling will handle any further correspondence," I stated, turning my back on the wreckage I had left behind. As I walked out of the library, past the frantic, hushed arguments beginning behind the closed door, I felt the last lingering tremor of that decades-long burden lift. It wasn't triumph that filled me, but a profound, weary clarity. Justice wasn't loud. It was surgical. I didn't return to the Manhattan penthouse. Instead, I took a private jet west. I had purchased a small, unassuming property nestled in the hills overlooking Santa Barbara, miles away from the concrete monuments and the cynical ambition that had defined my life. In the first week, I sat on the veranda, watching the Pacific horizon, the white noise of the waves washing away the last vestiges of my previous existence. I didn't need a legacy built on money anymore. The only thing I needed to build now was peace. The phone was quiet. The ledgers were clean. I was alone, certainly, but for the first time since I was a young man dreaming of success in the 1970s, the years melted away, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, the quiet, immeasurable luxury of being truly, profoundly free.